All right, we're going to watch Dr. Ilya Perlingieri. She's going to talk about climate change, but I think it goes a little bit deeper than that, and it's a very interesting video for a number of reasons. Let's get to it.
Dr. Ilya Perlingieri. Perlingieri is the author of The Uterus Crisis, one of the first books to link environmental toxins with the staggering rate of women's reproductive illnesses. In 2006, she was chair of Maine's first global warming conference. She has written for E!, the environmental magazine, and London's The Ecologist. Dr. Perlingieri notes that the issues of a radically changing global environment caused by humans must be addressed now from the local level up.
What's happened to accelerate these changes? The issues surrounding climate change and all of that is multi-layered. It's extremely complex. It doesn't just mean dealing with the climate, but the whole of the biosphere. And we're at the top of a very, very toxic food chain. What I'd like to focus on today in my talk is how weather modification, which was mentioned just briefly in a question, is playing a major role in this rapidity of environmental changes, but also in the vast increases of illness. So let me set the stage with some background.
So before we get into the rest of this, this video was posted January 20th of 2010. So it's a 13-year-old video, today being March 27th of 2023. And the Massachusetts School of Law this is their educational forum about global climate change. And there was a good speaker before this, so there's the entire video is about an hour long, and this is the second speaker, and she speaks for about a half an hour. But what really caught my attention was that she talks about hormone disruptors and the environmental impact on human health in a way that predates a lot of things that in the current climate are going on that many people weren't aware of, and so it gives a lot of context to some of the conversations about what kind of stewards we are for the environment and the earth, and what the impact of the nature of our society and industry technology has had on our human health, and questions whether or not, why we aren't doing more, and why we're not even bothering to do some of the research to figure out what the long-term health ramifications are of some of the technologies that we use or some of the industry that we have. So let's hear what she has to say.
And 15 years of independent research for my last book, which is called The Uterus Crisis. It is one of the first books to link the huge environmental crises that we have, multi-layered that they are, with women's reproductive problems. And they are staggering, from fetuses in utero all the way to elder women. Though I haven't done the research for you guys, you're not off the hook by any means, because sperm count is down by 50% with all the toxins in the environment.
Now that stat is something that I learned back at the turn of the century, turn of the millennium actually. In 1999, I had that was something that I was already aware of, that statistic, that the sperm count was down by 50% in men from the I believe it was the 1950s to around the year the mid 90s, and so that was well known. And by the time she's speaking, whether or not that number was increased or decreased, I don't know that there was any kind of calculation for that, or if she's using an old statistic.
But what I learned with this research is, and it's a staggering figure, if you can even get your mind around it, is that we are exposed on a regular basis to 100,000 chemicals every single day. It depends on the spew, where you are, and I do mean a spew because it's a toxic spew. And most of these have never been tested for human safety. We're the guinea pigs for an experiment that is way out of control, and this is one of the...
Well, at least that's just environmental. That's a huge number, a staggering number. I would imagine that probably crosses into foods and pharmaceuticals.
Reasons that we have high rates of cancer, although right now cancer is number 2, superseded by heart cardiovascular problems, which is now number 1, and asthma, which I will mention later, is number 3. In addition,
The other interesting fact is that asthma is an inflammatory condition. Heart disease is becoming to be known as an inflammatory condition of the blood vessel walls, and cancer has to do with immune disruption. So all three of those are heavily influenced by our ability to have our body determine what's self, what's non-self, and the interaction between our immune system and our environment.
there are 8,000 new chemicals that go online every year to which we're also exposed. 8,000. These two have never been tested for human safety. Chemicals and pharmaceuticals are tested one at a time, and because the way things are right now, there are very few independent labs and few independent scientists. So a lot of this is, as I say, the fox is guarding a scenario that's really pretty awful. And
That's a really good point. The fox not only is guarding the hen house, but drew the plans up and knows where the entrances and exits are, and has done all the work to know how it's fortified. And unfortunately, that leaves the human population, or us, the hens, at a very big disadvantage to having prolonged health. And testing things one at a time, there's no real way to figure out, like, okay, well, how do these things combine and what kind of impact do they have when you start to use chemicals together? So if it has an immune consequence, one chemical does, and you have two, how do those two things multiply together? Because it's not a straight addition type of formula.
We have known really since the 30s, particularly for issues surrounding women's reproductive problems, that tampons were unsafe in the 30s, but a lot of things are covered up, and that has not changed in 70 years. So having the pharmaceutical companies test things or the chemical companies test things doesn't necessarily mean that we're safe if something's put online.
Bingo.
In addition, these safety factors that the chemical and the pharmaceutical companies test for, they're testing one chemical at a time. This does not address what Dr. Theo Colburn in Our Stolen Future in 1996 addressed, and that is it's multiple. And one chemical plus one chemical does not equal two. One chemical plus one chemical could equal, especially in hormone-disrupting chemicals, 1,600 times the dose.
Wow.
And we're all walking time bombs. That is a reality. Everybody in this room. Bill Moyers did a great, great show.
Now, whether or not it is truly 1,600 times for every single, every different combination is kind of irrelevant. But just the nature of a comment like that is exactly what I was talking about. Like, it's not a addition problem, it's a multiplication problem of how these things influence and impact one another. And when you look at environmental chemicals that we're exposed to, whether that safety data has been, whether there's been some safety exploration into what the combination of these chemicals together, what kind of impact it may have on our health. If that research is not done, it leaves us at a tremendous disadvantage when it comes to our health. And that's just, when we're talking about the chemical side of things. And she hasn't even got into the pharmaceutical side of things, which is completely different because we're doing those things to ourselves. And oftentimes it's standard of care or things that are considered a normal part of, the management of a patient.
About 6 years ago, called Trade Secrets. Which is still available, I believe, on DVD, looking at this whole issue of the multiplicity of chemicals and the problems I should say, of greed have caused for Americans. And as I write in the Uterus Crisis, it's all about greed. It's not about our well-being and safety. And there are countless stories about the problems of people who have become critically ill or died, stories going back to the thalidomide crisis in the 60s and 70s, toxic shock syndrome, pesticide poisonings, which are really off the scale, even for small children, and Vioxx, just to name a few. It was on the market when they knew it was unsafe, and People were spending a fortune so that the companies could make billions of dollars. We are the guinea pigs in a huge and
I think that's, we are the guinea pigs, and the sad truth of the matter is that a lot of pharmaceutical companies put that into the mix of their investment package of if we put this medication or this drug out, and what kind of lawsuits will we face, what kind of impact from negative side effects will there be, and that's all rolled into their profit margin. They know what's likely to happen, and despite knowing that it's not, that there may be deleterious effects on human health, bad health outcomes for people, they still proceed forward with it because the amount that they're going to make is far greater than any kind of penalties they may get, because there's a lot of protections in place to allow for them to put drugs on market. And as long as they, have a little bit of due diligence, whether or not it's true due diligence in regard to the respect for human life, if they have a little bit, then they can say, well, we didn't know, or, proving negligence is pretty difficult.
complex experiment where the health and environmental repercussions are absolutely staggering. Babies are now born with what is called the body burden. That is, while they're growing in utero in their mom's bodies, they are already getting a chemical body burden that is passed on through the umbilical cord. And so by birth, these poor, innocent children are already affected. And there are staggering rates of birth deformities, cancers, and other reproductive-related illnesses that we did not have 20 or 30 years ago. When I was growing up, there was no such a thing as a children's hospital. Think about it. We have children's hospitals all over. What has happened? What has happened? Just think about that figure. What does...
That idea of a body burden, in the way I've been trained is we call that the toxic load, and that toxic load has an impact on the way that our immune system kind of protects itself, and these barrier systems that help the body to discern what's self and what's non-self. And as we have a larger and larger toxic load, or as she refers to as a body burden, of course that's passed on to our children. And so the thing that she doesn't really touch on that is really important is that it's not just that environment inside of the mother, but if that same chemical burden was in place in the grandmother, in the great-grandmother, that is imprinted in the DNA and passed down, so that now that burden isn't just the burden from one generation, it's the burden from multiple generations. And it's been shown that that transgenerational impact can go back, at least 4 generations on the male side and 7 generations on the female side. So there's an extreme amount of body burden. And so when you look at how colorectal cancer rates have started to increase, and where some of these body burdens started to change a little bit, things that were introduced in the 50s and 60s that have an impact on transgenerational health, that's where you start to see, well, now all of a sudden we're starting to see some of these chronic diseases pop up, and it really does mean we should reevaluate some of the things that we've considered as standard of care or standard of living, and whether or not the true burden of those things is worse now than it was when we introduced some of those protocols.
100,000 chemicals mean in a mixture that is not even being tested in its vast mathematical complicity. We breathe chemicals every day. We eat food grown in heavily pesticided soil that's greatly reduced in beneficial organisms and mineral content from 30 and 40 years ago. We drink water that is highly contaminated with other chemicals, including mercury, as Pat mentioned, and every other.
That's the other side. If you don't drink filtered water, then you are the filter.
Other kind of spew that you can even imagine. Robert Kennedy Jr. has been working with several water conservation organizations, water keepers, over the last 30 years to try and even clean up the PCBs in the Hudson River. And there have been frequent reports of rocket fuel in mother's milk and found in lettuce. What is that doing in our food supply? Secondly, 30 years of environmental laws have been systematically destroyed over the last 8 years. Americans are exposed to many higher levels of toxins, including mercury, from power plant emissions, as Pat had mentioned, from cement factories, and from multi-prepared vaccinations, the latter of which has resulted in autism, high rates of autism, ADD, and other cognitive troubles. For centuries, we've known that mercury, probably thousands of years, that mercury is deadly. There is no safe level of mercury, not at all. The Mad Hatter of Alice in Wonderland is based on the 17th and 18th century real Mad Hatters who died and went crazy before they did because of the use of mercury in making those tall hats that we see in historical paintings. There's no safe level, as I mentioned, of mercury. It takes decades to work its deadly action, and in a person's later years, brain function and cognition deteriorate and death ensues. I've seen it with my own mother.
You know, and a lot of those things happen with different types of heavy metals, not just mercury, but aluminum, or other types of metals like aluminum. And one of the major problems is that they will attach themselves in place of some of the metals that our body uses and enzymes naturally, and that it's supposed to use in those areas. And so now that metal is put into body tissue and stored there. And so, you know, especially if aluminum gets into the blood, it typically will move to the brain and stay there for somebody's entire life. And so when we talk about really checking into the safety of pharmaceutical interventions, it's important to keep in mind, like, okay, there are benefits, but at the same time, if we don't have a full grasp and understanding of what the consequences are, then we really can't make an informed choice on whether or not that's the right thing to do. And so she kind of alluded to mercury and vaccines, and that's, you know, been taken out of single-dose vaccines. There are maybe still one product or two products that have a multi-dose vaccine that still may contain some in there. But the aluminum is an adjuvant that bioaccumulates, and so the amount that is put into somebody at a young age, you know, and when you talk about multiple, the growing schedule of vaccinations, that's, you know, something that we really should investigate to figure out whether or not that has a long-term impact that outweighs the benefit of doing them all together versus maybe breaking them apart, or, you know, whatever the case may be. But we wouldn't know unless we do the work to look and figure that out.
Who was one of the leading dentists in the United States for 47 years. I've seen it with friends, and it's a pretty awful scenario to see somebody who was brilliant not even be able to communicate. Mercury is unsafe, and we are breathing it as we speak. Thirdly, in regard to climate change, there has been new research from several scientists just in this past year showing dwindling to no sunspot activity from our sun. The science is not perfect. We've heard from people earlier today saying it's a consensus and everything's always up for re-examination.
That's the way science works.
But this lack of sunspot activity could indicate from several scientists, if you need the websites and the particular references, I'll be glad to give them to you after my talk. This might be indicating that we're entering what is known as a Maunder minimum that is similar to the ice age that was mentioned earlier during the 17th century. This may indicate that, in fact, maybe the climate is not getting warmer, but much cooler. We just don't know. This is all up for changes. I will say, living in Maine and having just moved from California, and that's another story, Maine this past winter had 16 feet of snow. It's the highest, most significant snow level that we've had since records began to be kept during the 1870s.
I wouldn't be surprised if now in 2023 that record's been broken.
So this is all something that it's still a process that we still don't know what's going to happen. Finally, the fourth issue are the brown clouds that were mentioned just earlier. Does anybody know about the brown clouds other than Dr. Young? Two people. Okay, since last year and a little bit earlier, NASA has retrofitted a number of planes, and an international scientific team has been put together under Dr. V. Ramanathan at Scripps Institution of Oceanography. They are tracking, starting April last year, there was big articles in the Wall Street Journal and all over the West Coast, though it didn't seem to get the kind of attention I would have hoped. This international team has been tracking the pollution from India and from China, and the clouds really are brown, and I can tell you from living in California for 35 years that we don't see them here as much, but they're here because we're in a closed loop, and what affects one part of the country eventually comes around and hits other parts of.
I think that's an interesting concept, that we're in a closed loop, meaning that the Earth is a system and it's a closed system maintained by the atmospheric pressure that keeps everything swirling around the globe. And so something that it has an impact on one area will have an impact on others. And that, there's, when you look at what happened in the 40s when we were testing a lot of the nuclear bombs or atomic bombs and dropped some of those in a couple of places, the fallout of that radiation doesn't just stay there, and it goes from Asia and circulates towards the United States and then all across it. And so now we have, what we would call like genes, certain genes that are predictors of cancer, like the BRCA gene, the BRCA gene, which certain variants will indicate that people have a higher risk of breast cancer. And so when you look at what that gene actually does, it protects your DNA from double-stranded damage from radiation. And so, well, why would that gene be predictive of breast cancer? Well, it wasn't predictive of breast cancer in women born before 1940, but women born after 1940, it is predictive of breast cancer. And so when you look at the impact of that radiation that's now pervasive in the environment, what kind of impact does that have? Well, we start to see increases in cancer rates and relate them back to gene variations that our body would use to protect us from that type of environmental stress.
The planet. But the pollution is filled with industrial pollution that includes soot, heavy metals, urban exhaust, power plant emissions, including more mercury, acid, ash from coal-fired plants, home heating stoves, and forest fires. The highly toxic pollution is measured in what are known as teragrams. 1 teragram equals 2.2 billion pounds of toxic soot and assorted other things that are coming here from China. It takes about a week, give or take, the weather. So in addition to our own pollution figures, we are now getting more than 40 billion pounds of pollution annually from Asia. And pollution figures have doubled over the last 20 years. The U.S. gets the heaviest load of these brown clouds during the springtime and less over the summer. This is a global...
Which would mean, you would expect that that would have some kind of impact on illnesses, respiratory illnesses, and that type of thing, because it has, when you're breathing in particulate matter, not only does it cause stress from bringing those chemicals in, it also causes inflammation, and that inflammation can leave our mucosal tissues more susceptible to, infection, or because they're already under stress. And of course, stress over time with exposure to different types of respiratory agents can, pay a toll.
Issue, and we certainly as Americans haven't been stepping up to the plate. A survey report issued by the World Bank in 2007 estimates that there are about 460,000 premature Chinese deaths a year just from breathing polluted air and drinking poisoned water, although this was questioned by an official of China's State Environmental Protection Administration saying that it was baseless. However, the Financial Times and the Chinese government, which conducted this research in partnership with the World Bank, asked that the lender, that is the World Bank, not publish these estimates for fear that it could trigger social unrest. China is beset by growing public alarm about acid rain.
And it's not just China. Our government does the same.
and toxic water, and has promised by 2010 to cut their pollutants by 10%, but even last year they failed to meet last year's measurements that they had done. The United States is got its own shameful statistics, and I'd like to just give you some of them.
Here we go.
Car emissions, which include benzene, which is highly toxic and causes cardiovascular problems and an elevated blood pressure, kills 30,000 Americans each year. The risk of cancer from breathing diesel exhaust that we breathe every day is about 10 times more than ingesting all other toxic pollutants combined, with diesel emissions contributing to over 70% of the cancer risk from air pollution in the United States.
Wow.
Third, we take the equivalent of
That is a staggering number. If it's true that diesel contributes to 70% of all airborne cancer, that's just phenomenal.
smoking 20 cigarettes every day, even if we're non-smokers, just due to air pollution that we're breathing every second. The Boston area ranks number 5 in the country for premature deaths due to diesel pollution annually. And in the state of Massachusetts alone, diesel emissions are responsible for the following figures of annual statistics: 450 premature deaths, 700 non-fatal heart attacks, 9,900 asthma attacks, 13,000 respirator symptoms in children, and 60,000 lost workdays. According to the EPA, emissions from power plants contribute to over 2,800 lung cancers and deaths, and 38,200 heart attacks annually in the United States. So this is just a little bit of what we are dealing with in terms of figures of
And that's just diesel. That's not talking about agricultural herbicides and pesticides and other types of, food colorants and chemicals that are put into our food to change flavors, tastes, colors, and so on.
toxicity in the air that we breathe every day. This does not include weather modification. Ancient cultures used to do native tribal dances to pray for rain, to bring areas that were very dry and have good rainfall. In the 20th century, clouds were seeded by numerous countries around the globe with various chemicals to produce rain. China was just doing this over the summer in Beijing to make sure that there weren't any rain, that there wasn't any rain during the Olympics. But all this has changed dramatically with the U.S. military's secretive research.
So the Beijing Olympics, they were able to seed the clouds in a way that prevented normal rain cycles, so there would be no rain during the Olympic Games. I think I remember hearing about that, but that's obviously this technology has been around for a while and we've been working on it, not just the Chinese, but the Americans.
And plans to control the planet's natural weather. This has not been given very much press, and we have to remember that we have a corporate-owned press where 85% of radio, television, and print media is owned by 5 corporations. So they're not going to talk about things that are of really serious consequence, and that's...
And remember, this is 13 years ago. The media has been owned by corporate interests for a long period of time, from advertisers to the conglomerates that own and decide what they're going to put on, on the news or what is news. It's an old problem.
Somewhat of the blessing, a mixed blessing of the internet, but there's certainly plenty of information on weather modification. The Air Force is on record as saying, quote, they want to control the weather by 2025, and we are not talking about just seeding the clouds for rain. Weather modification means, quote...
And here we are near 2025. What is the impact of that? How close are they to their goal of being able to control the weather? I know now we hear new terms about atmospheric rivers in California here. And, I was talking to my father-in-law the other day about that, and never heard that term in our life. Not that it's new, but not that it wasn't popularized. And using a phrase like that seems like it's designed to evoke a little bit of fear in people. And if they're able to consistently change the messaging and target specific audiences with making them afraid of something as simple as the weather, because they can modify it in a way that may not have the best results for us. That in and of itself is a cause for caution.
Any activity performed with the intention of producing artificial changes in the composition, behavior, or dynamics of the atmosphere, unquote. And as of April this year, there are more than 150 different weather modification programs around the world.
Wow.
Since about 2000, the Department of Defense and the Department of Energy have been spraying the entire United States sky with a toxic brew of chemicals and other biologic agents.
Biologic agents.
Just want to show you something. We have two different kinds of trails in the sky right now. One are called contrails. How many of you know what contrails are? Contrails are what have been around from the ends of planes since World War II. These are very, very short exhaust trails that usually evaporate within a few minutes. You just look up at the sky and you'll just see a jet, sometimes with 4 trails, but it evaporates pretty quickly. How many of you know what chemtrails are? Nobody. The military and some commercial planes are spraying us with what are called chemtrails. I want you to look at these. And oftentimes, before there's a weather front, there are heavy assaults from these planes just before a weather front is changed and comes in. Military and some commercial jets have been fitted with huge barrels of at least 49 different kinds of documented chemical poisons. Among other documented ingredients in this toxic man-made clouds are pathogenic molds, fungi, weaponized viruses, and made in some places like the secret site at Fort Detrick, Maryland, which is supposed to be a...
Weaponized viruses that spread through the air and are seeded. I know, at least in my local area, there were, it wasn't common to see that there was a change in weather pattern before there was a pretty big incidence of respiratory illness in the area where winds picked up and other things like that. So, it's interesting to see if there was more data available to find out like what particular type of weaponized pathogens are they putting into the air.
Cancer site, but there are a number of scholars and professors tracking this that have big questions about this. Barium and nanoaluminum particles. What do these do to the human body? Barium is an alkaline earth mineral. It was discovered in 1774. At low doses, it can act as a muscle stimulant. At high doses, it detrimentally affects the heart and the nervous system. Barium is toxic to all mammals, and that means not just humans. Aluminum, which is the most abundant metal in the Earth's crust, is known to diminish kidney function and destroy brain cells and cognitive function. Just think about it. Just between the aluminum and the mercury that we're breathing all the time, we've got already a serious issue about brain function and cognitive function.
Not to mention
there is
dental
also
amalgams.
Documented evidence that the aluminum in chemtrails is released as nanoparticles, and that when they reach the Earth environment for wildlife, in lakes and streams, it's causing serious problems with wildlife there. Researchers are also finding that nanoparticles interfere with the growth of plants. Nanotechnology is totally unregulated. Just this past month, a new research report came out showing and documenting for the first time that these nanoparticles actually go through the skin. Well, if you breathe them, whether they go through the skin or whether you're inhaling them, it's still a problem, a serious problem. Other toxic chemicals that have been documented.
Well, that's good. Breathing, definitely get them in. Going through the skin, definitely get it in. And if nanoparticles are put into the bloodstream, that would also be problematic too, I would imagine.
Include ammonia, ammonium chloride, bismuth, cadmium, one of the most toxic elements also in the environment, hexabromobenzene, lead, potassium iodine, potassium perchlorate, sulfur, and xylene. This is just a toxic spew of carcinogens, serious respiratory and skin irritants, cardiovascular and gastrointestinal toxicants.
Some people seem a little uncomfortable.
I'm asking, is there a relationship between asthma, now the #3 killer in the United States, and staggering rates of it for small children, up from #10 a decade ago, and the chemtrails? According to Clifford Carnicom, who's been studying chemtrails for 9 years now, and I met with him to discuss this in detail this summer, quote, "The true nature of these aerosol operations remain undisclosed and closed to fair examination by the public. All of this is being done by stealth to keep us in ignorance." There is a long, long history in the United States, tragically, not the kind of history that you learn in college textbooks, about secret chemical exposure to which Americans were subjected. I'd like to read you just a few of them. In 1931, Dr. Cornelius Rhodes, under the auspices of the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Investigations, infected human subjects with cancer cells. They were not told about it. He later went on to establish the U.S. Army Biological Warfare Facility in Maryland, Utah, and Panama, and then was named to the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission. While there, he began a series of radiation exposures, experiments on American soldiers and civilians in hospitals. In 1942, Chemical Warfare Services began mustard gas experiences on approximately 4,000 servicemen. The experiments continued until 1945 and made use of the Seventh-day Adventists who chose to become human guinea pigs rather than serve on duty. 1965, prisoners in a prison in Philadelphia were subjected to dioxin. Dioxin is so toxic, it is a byproduct of chlorine when it breaks down, whether it's in Clorox or in tampons, and a teaspoon could literally kill the entire planet. Dioxin is a carcinogen, and it's part of Agent Orange. That was suspected even before the military used it for Desert Storm. In
I think that's the other side of things. You know, tampons on their own may be problematic for women's health, but at the very least, get in organic cotton tampons that have not been bleached, so there's no chlorine residues in them, would be a excellent first step until you figure out, you know, what to do, whether it's menstrual cups or whatnot. But that intimate exposure for a prolonged period of time to those chemicals is something that really needs to be paid attention to, and that could also be with bleached clothing, white underwear. Organic cotton would be an option that's unbleached. But you know, if we don't know, how do we make a choice to do something different?
1996, the Department of Defense admits that Desert Storm exposure for all of the military, they were exposed to chemical agents, including Agent Orange. So I have questions.
We do a lot of experimenting on our
Questions that have to be part of
military.
an urgently needed public discussion and outcry. When is this going to stop? Obviously, you don't know, and I would urge you, they're outside, there's a list of websites that you can go to, not just to Clifford Carnicom's, but this is the most, his website is the most well-documented one with lots of medical information. I've talked to over 100 doctors just in this past 6 months, naturopaths, MDs, all sorts of people in healthcare, and there we have staggering rates of upper respiratory and cardiovascular problems that we never used to have. There's a brand new emerging field, and that's called environmental cardiology, and they're not even dealing with the issues of weather modifications and chemtrails. I'd like to know, how are the real drought conditions by nature exacerbated by a constant spew of aerosols in the chemtrails? How much of global warming or climate change is actually caused by billions of tons of these aerosols that have been sprayed over us for the last 8 years without our permission? It's not just CO2 emissions that we have to deal with, but we have to deal with weather modification. How is weather modification?
I mean, I think it's that old analogy that many of us have heard from parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles. You don't use the bathroom where you sleep, but in the way that we've been caring for the earth and the environment around us, we're putting a lot of toxic stuff into the environment and then not understanding, like, well, hey, that's probably going to have a negative impact on our health.
By the military, destabilizing our planet's natural weather.
Yeah.
A controversial weather modification bill was just passed. Bush just signed it to the 109th Congress. There was no public discussion. These bills did not include any agricultural, water, EPA, or public representatives, and did not have any provisions for congressional, state, county, or public oversight of either expenditures, medical, and/or environmental consequences. In other words, we've really been guinea pigs for at least the last 8 years with literally every breath we take. 7 days a week, 365 days a year. What we are breathing now, as one of my dear friends says, the indoor air is just the same. What the indoor air is just the outdoor air inside. In addition, the Pentagon is on record this summer as saying it wants to resume open-air testing of biologic weapons. There's a flyer outside on this with some research that Professor Francis Boyle has done. And he's been quoted recently as saying, the Pentagon is fully prepared to launch biological warfare by means of anthrax. All the equipment has been acquired and all the training conducted, and most combat-ready members of the U.S. Armed Forces has been given protective equipment and vaccine. Do you know that as of October 1st, how many of you know that we are on an anthrax alert that was issued by the Secretary of Health and Human Services? Anybody know? 1 person, 2 people, 3 people.
I think we have to move along to lunch, Ilya.
So I would like to say that we don't have Star Trek technology. It's just a Hollywood fantasy. Yet much of this technology is being used on us without our permission. We are signatories to no germ warfare and to the Nuremberg trials. This is our home. This is our home. Earth is our home. We don't have Star Trek technology to go to another planet. We have consequences that are moral and ethical in their ramifications, and we don't need to have any more toxins. Our planet will survive, but we will not with these staggering rates of health issues.
There it is.
And I ask you, do we want to live on a planet that is a sewer? Think about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, I mean, I think what she said is really poignant. It really does, at some point, we have to start thinking about our role and what we're doing here and how we go about fixing it. Whether it's, there's no easy way to go about it. It's going to hurt no matter what we do, because a lot of the things that we consider are common, modern luxuries or a standard of living, those are the very things that put us at risk of continuing to pollute the environment. but we should have an understanding of what those things are. And if a lot of this research is being done or conducted without our knowledge, and we're not allowed informed consent to be part of those experimentations, that's always wrong. And whether that be with experimental pharmaceuticals, whether that be with experiments with weather modification or bioengineering, all of those things have a consequence and have an impact on us and unfortunately on the generations to come. And we should have a say in what that is and at least be knowledgeable or have the awareness and the ability to consent to that type of those type of experimentations. All right, well, I hope you found this informative. This is a great video, and some of the information was new to me. So and it's old information. It's been there for at least 13 years here on YouTube. All right, I'm Dr. Richard L. Robles, and I hope this information helps you kind of get a better understanding of the world around you and helps you get on your path to health. Thanks.